A motorcycle crash doesn't ask for permission. It hits fast, hits hard, and leaves behind a silence no one can undo. The scariest part is how normal everything feels just before it happens. Most riders never think the road ahead is their last. So ask yourself this on your worst day: will a relaxing trip save your life or end it? Number 1. Olga Pronina. On the streets of Vladivostok, Olga Pronina looked impossible to ignore. Online, the 40-year-old single mother and hairdresser had transformed herself into Monica, an internet biker star, with a six-figure following, a BMW S1000 RR, and the kind of raw confidence that made people stop scrolling. To her fans, she wasn't just riding a motorcycle. She was selling fearlessness. Her clips felt made for virality, high speed, one hand on the bars, her body twisted sideways, danger turned into performance. She posted the kind of footage that made viewers feel two things at once: admiration and dread. Even when she admitted how extreme it was, even when she warned people not to copy her, she kept chasing that same adrenaline hit, like the next ride had to top the last one. Then came July 31st, 2017. The weather was clear. The road was dry. Nothing about that moment looked unusual until everything did. Olga lost control of her BMW near Vladivostok and slammed into a roadside barrier at high speed. The crash was so violent that the motorcycle was torn apart, and she suffered fatal injuries before anyone could save her. In an instant, the image of invincibility was gone. That is why her story still lands so hard. Seconds earlier, she was the same woman her audience had watched again and again, bold, glamorous, untouchable. Then reality hit harder than any video ever could. Behind the viral persona was a real human being, a mother with a teenage daughter, and a life that ended on a road that gave her no second chance. Number 2. Butch Laswell. Born in Las Vegas and raised in Overton, Nevada, he grew up obsessed with motorcycle jumps, building ramps as a kid, and chasing the kind of airborne glory that made Evel Knievel a legend. But Laswell was not just another thrill-seeker. He turned that obsession into a career, becoming a professional stunt rider, known for treating the impossible like it was simply the next challenge. By the 1990s, he had built a reputation that felt almost untouchable. He had logged thousands of successful jump set records for motorcycle height jumps and earned respect for being more precise than reckless. That was what made him so compelling. He didn't look like a man flirting with death. He looked like a man who had figured out how to control it. And that illusion of control is exactly what made his final stunt so haunting. On March 10, 1996, in Mesquite, Nevada, Laswell lined up for the jump that was supposed to change everything. Thousands of spectators were there. Guinness representatives were watching. Cameras were rolling. He had already delayed the attempt because of gusting winds, waiting for the right moment before sending his Honda CR 500 up a 27-foot ramp at about 70 miles per hour. He cleared the skywalk bridge, but a crosswind pushed him left of the landing ramp, and he slammed onto the pavement below. That is why Butch Laswell's story still feels so brutal. After years of calculated risk, after thousands of jumps, the stunt that was meant to make him bigger than ever became the one that ended his life. He was 37 years old. One gust of wind erased the line between mastery and tragedy, and in front of a stunned crowd, a man who had spent his life flying suddenly had nowhere left to land. Number 3. Joy S.J. Harris. Joy S.J. Harris did not look like someone waiting for permission to make history. Born Sequana Joy Harris, she came into motorcycle racing later than most learned to ride in 2009 earned her license by 2013, and by 2014 had become the first African-American woman licensed to race professionally in motorcycle road racing. She wasn't just fast, she represented a door kicking open for people who had rarely seen themselves in that world. That is what made her rise feel so powerful. Harris built her name through discipline, not hype, and carried herself like someone who understood exactly how hard she had fought to be there. When she landed a stunt job on Deadpool, 2 doubling for Zazie Beetz' character Domino, it looked like the next chapter of a breakthrough story, bigger platform, bigger spotlight, bigger future. But it was also her first stunt shoot for a film, and that detail would become impossible to ignore afterward. On August 14, 2017, in downtown Vancouver, Harris rode into a scene that was supposed to be controlled. Instead, she lost control of the motorcycle, struck a curb, and was thrown into the window of a building near Rogers Tower. She was not wearing a helmet, and she died at the scene. In one horrifying instant, a woman who had become a symbol of progress was gone, and the set of a superhero movie turned into the site of a real-life tragedy. What makes this story hit so hard is that the aftermath pointed to more than bad luck. WorkSafe BC later said the production failed to conduct a proper risk assessment, failed to provide adequate supervision, lacked barriers to stop the rider or bike from leaving the set, and failed to ensure she wore required safety headgear. Harris should have been remembered only for the barriers she broke. Instead, her name became a warning about what happens when ambition moves faster than safety. Number 4, Barry Oakley. Some tragedies feel less like accidents and more like fate closing in. Barry Oakley, born Raymond, Barry Oakley III was the thunder in the low end of the Allman Brothers Band, the bassist whose melodic, restless playing helped define the band's sound. On stage, he felt alive, loud, and impossible to replace. Off stage, though, grief had already started tearing holes in everything. When Duane Allman died in a motorcycle crash in Macon. In 1971, Oakley never really came back from it. Friends and bandmates saw the change. The energy was still there, but so was the pain. He was grieving hard, spiraling, and trying to carry on inside a band built around chemistry that had just been shattered. The music survived, but the wound never closed. Then, on November 11, 1972, the nightmare repeated itself. Oakley was riding his motorcycle through Macon when he crossed the center line on a sharp curve and collided with a city bus. He was thrown from the bike and hit his head. Shockingly, he refused treatment at the scene and went home instead. Hours later, delirious and in severe pain, he was rushed to the hospital where he died from massive head injuries. He was only 24. What makes Barry Oakley's death so haunting is the cruel symmetry of it. He died just 3 blocks from where Duane Allman had been killed the year before, same city, same kind of machine, same age. That coincidence turned an already heartbreaking loss into rock history's darkest echo. Barry was not just another victim of a crash. He was a brilliant musician, swallowed by grief, then by the same road that had already taken his brother. Number 5, Charles P. Pete Conrad Jr. Charles P. Pete Conrad Jr. was not just another famous rider. He was the 3rd human being to walk on the moon, a Navy test pilot who commanded Apollo 12 and later led the first crewed Skylab mission. He had built a life around courage, precision, and surviving the kind of danger most people can barely imagine. That is what makes his story hit so hard. Pete Conrad was the kind of man people assume would never go out in an ordinary way. He was funny, sharp, fearless, and larger than life, the kind of American hero who seemed built to come back from every mission with another unbelievable story. After everything he had done in the sky and beyond it, he looked untouchable. But on July 8, 1999, the danger waiting for him was not in space. It was on a curve near Ojai, California. Conrad was riding with his wife Nancy and friends on the way to Monterey when he lost control of his motorcycle on a turn. He was wearing a helmet and riding gear, and authorities said he appeared to be traveling under the posted speed limit. Even so, the crash left him with internal injuries so severe that he died hours later at Ojai Valley Hospital. He was 69. And that is the cruel power of this story. A man who crossed space was still vulnerable to one bad moment on Earth. Pete Conrad survived the vacuum of the moon, the pressure of command, and some of the most dangerous years in aviation history, only to be taken by a split second on a California road. That contrast is what makes his ending unforgettable. Not because he was an astronaut, but because even legends do not get a warning before tragedy strikes. Number 6, The Fallen Seven. Not every motorcycle tragedy begins with speed. Sometimes it starts with something far more terrifying, an ordinary group ride open road ahead, and absolutely no reason to think the next few seconds will end in fire-twisted metal and bodies thrown across the highway. That is exactly what happened on June 21, 2019 in Randolph, New Hampshire, when members of the Jarheads Motorcycle Club, a group made up of Marines veterans and spouses, were riding together on US Route 2. There were 15 motorcycles in the group, carrying 22 people. Then a pickup truck towing an empty vehicle hauling trailer crossed the center line and smashed into the formation. The impact tore through the riders in seconds, and a post-crash fire swallowed the truck and 2 of the motorcycles. By the time it was over, 5 riders and 2 passengers were dead, while 7 others were left injured, many of them carrying physical and emotional wounds that would never fully heal. What makes this story hit even harder is who these people were. This was not some reckless street race or a stunt gone wrong. It was a brotherhood ride, people who had already lived through service, sacrifice, and loss now sharing the road together like countless groups do every summer in America. Survivors later described the scene as pure carnage, the kind of horror even military experience had not prepared them to witness. And the pain did not end at the crash site. In 2022, the truck driver Volodymyr Zhukovsky was found not guilty on the criminal charges tied to the collision, a verdict that reopened the wound for families and survivors. Even after that acquittal, New Hampshire safety officials upheld the suspension of his license, finding enough evidence that he had operated the truck negligently. That is why the Fallen Seven still lingers, not just as a deadly crash, but as a story of grief, outrage, and a silence that never really lifted from that road. Number 7, Cedric Benson and Aamna Najam. Some crashes feel especially cruel because nothing about the night looks unusual until the moment it turns fatal. On August 17, 2019, Farmware. Running back, Cedric Benson, 36, was riding his BMW motorcycle through West Austin with Aamna Najam, a 27-year-old recent University of Texas graduate in audiology, when their ride ended in a violent collision that neither of them survived. What makes this story hit harder is who they were just before everything fell apart. Benson was a Texas football legend, a former Doak Walker Award winner, and an NFL first-round pick who played for the Bears, Bengals, and Packers. Najam had just earned her AUD in audiology from UT in May 2019 and was remembered by her family as someone driven by compassion and a desire to help others. They were not standing at the edge of a downfall. They were still in the middle of life. According to Austin police, Benson was riding at a high rate of speed in the left lane of FM 2222 when his motorcycle collided with a 2014 Dodge van, attempting a left turn from Mount Bonnell Road around 10:20 p.m. Witnesses and a passenger from the van tried to help, but Benson and Najam were both pronounced dead at the scene. Residents later told reporters the intersection was dangerous, with blind turns and hills that made visibility worse. That is why this tragedy lingers. Hours earlier, Benson had posted a photo of his motorcycle online, just another snapshot of an ordinary Saturday evening. Then, in one flash of metal and impact, a celebrated athlete and a young doctor with her whole future ahead of her were gone. Their story is not just about a deadly crash. It is about how brutally fast an ordinary night can become the last chapter of two very different lives. Number 8. Kim Thompson. For some people, motorcycles were never about showing off. They were just part of a life built on movement, freedom, and routine, right up until routine turns deadly. That is what makes the story of Kim Thompson so unsettling. He was not known for checklist stunts or viral fame. He was a respected Australian surfboard shaper, a pioneer behind water-cooled, and a longtime figure in the global surfing world, whose work helped shape the boards countless others rode into history. By the time of his death, Thompson had spent decades in Thailand, where he was deeply connected to Cobra International and the surf manufacturing industry. In surfing, his name carried weight. He was part craftsman, part innovator, the kind of figure whose influence stretched far beyond the spotlight. That is why the news hit so hard, because this was not just the death of a rider, but the sudden loss of a man whose life had quietly shaped an entire culture. On November 1st, 2022, in Chonburi, Thailand, Thompson was riding his motorcycle when a truck turned at an intersection ahead of him. According to reports and CCTV descriptions, he swerved to avoid it, lost control, and slammed into an electrical pole. The impact was catastrophic. First responders attempted to help, but Thompson died from devastating injuries at the scene. What should have been just another ordinary ride ended in a split second of chaos and violence. What makes this story linger is how brutally random it feels. Kim Thompson spent his life creating things tied to beauty balance, and the ocean then lost everything on a road, in a moment he likely never saw coming. There is no bigger reminder than that sometimes tragedy does not arrive with a warning. Sometimes it cuts through an ordinary day and leaves behind a silence an entire community can feel. Number 9. Burak Khan Tashan. Some stories hurt more because they were moving toward happiness, not danger. Burak Khan Tashan was a young motorcycle influencer from Turkey whose life online was built around speed passion and the kind of freedom that makes riders feel untouchable. But behind the bike content and the growing audience was something even more personal. He was engaged to fellow motorcycle enthusiast Yaron Kara, and the two were preparing for a future that suddenly felt wide open. That is what makes his story land so hard. Burak was only 23 years old, and by the summer of 2023, he had built a strong following on Instagram by sharing his love for motorcycles and the lifestyle around them. His posts were not just about machines. They were about identity romance and a young man who genuinely believed he had found the person he wanted to spend his life with. Just weeks after announcing their engagement, everything changed. In August 2023, while riding in the Sarasam district of Adana, Turkey, Burak crashed after his motorcycle struck a dog that ran into his path. The impact threw him from the bike and left him with severe injuries. He was rushed to the hospital, but he did not survive. In a matter of seconds, a normal ride became a fatal wreck, and a life that looked like it was just beginning was cut short before it had the chance to become what he and his fiancée imagined. Not a stunt, not a race, not some headline-chasing act of recklessness. Just one unexpected moment on the road, and everything after it became grief. Burak's story is haunting because it reminds you that sometimes the most devastating crashes do not come from chasing danger. They come from believing you still have time. Number 10. Indian Larry. Indian Larry, born Lawrence Desmet, was one of those men. He was not famous for being careful or ordinary. He was a legendary American chopper builder, artist, and stunt rider whose name became tied to old-school custom bike culture, raw charisma, and machines that looked more like rebellion than transportation. By the early 2000s, his recognition had surged through TV appearances and bike shows, turning him into one of the most unforgettable faces in the custom motorcycle world. That is what made his final moment feel so brutally cinematic. In late August 2004, Larry was at the Liquid Steel Classic and Custom Bike Series in Concord, North Carolina, appearing during the filming of his third biker build-off. This was his world, crowds, cameras, roaring engines, and the kind of performance that blurred the line between craftsmanship and danger. He had built a life making motorcycles feel like art, and he had built a reputation on doing the kind of things most people would never dare try. Then everything broke in front of the crowd. While performing one of his trademark stunts, standing upright on the seat of his moving bike, Larry lost control and fell, suffering devastating head injuries. Associated Press reported that the crash happened while he was performing, before about 8,000 people, and officials said he was not wearing a helmet. He was taken to a hospital near Charlotte, but he died from those injuries on August 30th, 2004, at age 55. What makes Indian Larry's story so haunting is how perfectly the ending mirrors the life. He did not die in retirement, far from the spotlight. He died doing the very thing that made people believe he was larger than life. That is why his story still hits hard. The same fearlessness that built the legend also became the final scene. And in the world he helped define, that kind of ending feels less like an accident and more like a warning written in steel speed and one terrible second. Number 11. Nicky Hayden. Some names do not need an introduction in motorcycle racing, and Nicky Hayden was one of them. The 2006 MotoGP world champion, known everywhere as the Kentucky Kid, built his legend on grit, calm under pressure, and the kind of blue-collar charisma fans never forgot. He was not just fast, he felt real, humble, and impossible not to root for. That is what makes his story hit differently. Unlike most of the tragedies in this list, the crash that took Hayden's life did not happen on a motorcycle. In May 2017, while training on a bicycle on the Riviera di Rimini in Italy, Hayden was involved in a collision with a car. The irony is brutal. A man who had survived years at the highest level of motorcycle racing was fatally injured during a ride that should have felt routine. Hayden was rushed to a local hospital and then transferred to Bufalini Hospital in Cesena, where the racing world waited and hoped for a miracle. It never came. On May 22, 2017, 5 days after the crash, MotoGP confirmed that Nicky Hayden had died from the injuries he sustained. He was 35 years old. In a matter of seconds, one of America's most beloved riders was gone. What makes Nicky Hayden's ending so haunting is the contrast. He had conquered the biggest stage in motorcycle racing, earned the respect of rivals around the world, and built a legacy that reached far beyond trophies. Yet in the end, it was not a championship battle or a high-speed race that took him. It was one sudden impact on an ordinary road. That is why his story still hurts, because even legends do not get to choose how tragedy finds them. Number 12, Marco Simoncelli. Marco Simoncelli, the wild-haired Italian known to fans as Super Sick, was one of those riders. He was the 2008 250 cubic centimeter world champion, a rising MotoGP star from Cattolica, Italy, and the kind of talent who looked like he was still only beginning to show the world what he could become. That is what makes his story hit so hard. Simoncelli had the speed, the personality, and the presence that made people remember him instantly. He raced with aggression, emotion, and zero fear, which made him thrilling to watch and impossible to ignore. By 2011, he was chasing his first MotoGP victory, and everything about his career suggested the biggest moments were still ahead of him. Then came October 23, 2011, at the Malaysian Grand Prix in Sepang. On the second lap, Simoncelli lost control and slid back across the track into the path of Colin Edwards and Valentino Rossi, who could not avoid him. Reuters reported that he was struck in the collision, his helmet was knocked off, and he later died from his injuries. He was just 24 years old, and the race was cancelled after the crash. What makes Marco Simoncelli unforgettable is not only how he died, but how alive he felt right before it happened. He was not fading away. He was rising. That is why this tragedy still lingers in MotoGP, because in one split second, a rider who looked built for a huge future became one of the sport's most painful memories. And for anyone watching, it was a brutal reminder that sometimes the brightest careers are the ones cut short the fastest.